Welcome. We'll just get started in a little bit. We'll give it a couple minutes before, just to let everybody in. Welcome. I'm Crystal Golly, the Sustainable Program Senior Manager here at the Climate Registry. Thank you to all of you for being here today for the Climate Registry's WEN workshop on navigating Scope 3 calculations for water and wastewater sectors. Before we begin, I'll go over, oops. Before we begin, I'll go over some quick sorry guys, just a little bit of a technical difficulty here. Before we begin, I'll go over some quick housekeeping tips that most of you are no doubt familiar with by now. We are recording today's meeting. The webinar recording will be shared with the attendees once it is available. All attendees are on mute by default. You can ask questions at any time by typing them into the Zoom question box. We have time for Q&A during the afternoon and after the presentation. Alyssa has kindly volunteered to stay on about 15 minutes after 11:30 if there's any additional questions that come in through the Q&A. So we'll end the recording at 11:30 and she'll stay on just for a little bit if there's any additional questions. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Climate Registry, here is a little bit of a background. The Climate Registry is a nonprofit organization established by states and provinces in 2007 to expand on the work of the California Climate Action Registry. Developed in 2001 by the state of California to guide California's businesses as they work to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and mitigate their environmental impacts. Recognizing that climate change is a global issue and success in emissions reporting must be based on consistent data in an integrated system that stretches beyond California's borders. The Climate Registry was established to include all of North America in this essential mission. The Climate Registry continues the hard work to inspire, educate, and connect organizations so that we can be a strong, positive force in building a sustainable future. The Climate Registry designs and operates voluntary and compliant greenhouse gas emissions reporting programs worldwide. We assist organizations in measuring, reporting, and verifying greenhouse gas emissions in their operations to manage and reduce emissions. Additionally, we create and manage innovative tools such as the Net Zero Portal to measure and report greenhouse gas emissions and reduction goals. The organization also drives action and ambition by recognizing and showcasing climate leadership through the Climate Registered Accelerator Recognition Program and consults with governments nationally and internationally on all aspects of greenhouse gas measurement, reporting, and verification. In order to understand your organization's environmental impact, the first step is to complete an accurate greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And the first benefit is gaining a better understanding your company's greenhouse gas emitting activities and determining where you should focus your reduction efforts. This allows you to establish a baseline inventory which sets a reference point for your company's net zero or greenhouse gas reduction goal you want to include in your decarbonization strategy or climate action plan. Lastly, transparency, which is a key principle. Mm, apologies, my computer is just being really weird this morning. Lastly, transparency, which is a key principle of our work at the Climate Registry. Taking care to publicly report and verify your footprint is a clear indicator to all stakeholders that you are committed to taking action and being held accountable. Reporting greenhouse gas emissions is essential to mitigating climate change and creating a more sustainable economy. The Climate Registry members have access to two registries to report their greenhouse gas emissions and track their progress in emissions reductions: the Carbon Footprint Registry and the Water Energy Nexus Registry. The Carbon Footprint Registry is a renowned voluntary greenhouse gas reporting program available to any organization eager to decarbonize their operations. The Water Energy Nexus Registry is also a voluntary reporting program focused on the intersection of water and energy systems that is currently available to organizations with operations within California. While the Water Energy Nexus is currently only available to organizations with operations within California, all of our protocols and guidance documents, including the Water Energy Nexus Protocol, are available to all TCR members, and this information can be extremely valuable to organizations across North America. Reporting a carbon footprint or a water energy footprint is important, but it can be difficult to know where to begin. Fortunately, we're here to support you through every step of the process. We have authored six reporting protocols that your organization can rely on throughout your reporting journey. Our general reporting protocol is a foundation of the Climate Registry's greenhouse gas reporting program and can be used in conjunction with our sector-specific protocols, such as the Water Energy Nexus Protocol that provides methodology and metrics for reporting water-related greenhouse gas emissions. All of these protocols are all publicly available on the Climate Registry's website. We believe that access to information should be free and readily available to anyone looking to take such action. However, additional guidance and support are available for organizations who wish to become members and take advantage of our resources, tools, and network of climate professionals. We've helped hundreds of organizations measure their greenhouse gas emissions, and we have greenhouse gas emissions reporting experts available to support you every step of the way. We can train your existing staff on how to build an inventory, and we're on call to answer technical questions as they come up during the process. Based on the experience we have also developed resources to answer common problems or address special topics that weren't covered by existing guidance. Reporting to the Climate Registry provides high quality data that can be used to demonstrate leadership with stakeholders that may open doors for funding and assist in making more informed decisions that drive innovation and support a resilient infrastructure. When you work with us, you're really joining a network of the other organizations who are committed to walking the walk. You'll have opportunities to connect with other organizations in your sector and share strategies and lessons learned along the way. I'd like to now pass it to Alyssa Benchamal, a project manager at the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute. Her expertise includes corporate and national greenhouse gas accounting, MRV capacity building, data management systems, and a program implementation. At GHGMI, Alyssa leads the software evaluation program, delivers capacity building training, authors technical reports, and provides technical expertise to multiple MRV systems. Alyssa's professional experience also includes the Water Energy GHG Nexus. Prior to working at GHGMI, Alyssa worked as a sustainability specialist at the Climate Registry, leading the implementation of the Water Energy Nexus Registry for California, developing and delivering GHG training, and developing verification guidance for water and wastewater related data and performance metrics. Alyssa, I'll pass it off to you now.
Thank you so much, Crystal. And as I gain control of the slides, I think everybody can. I would like to thank the Climate Registry for inviting me today to be a speaker for this webinar. It's a pleasure to be here. And I already see some familiar names on the attendance here with us, and you probably also, I think I'm having the same issues with the control. Hopefully that will go away soon. But some of you may recall I was at TCR beginning of 2018 when we were doing the the development of the Water Energy Nexus Registry. So any day that I get to go back into this project is a good day in my books. And let's see, let me try to gain full control of the slides who were really behaving very weirdly today. I apologize about that. Let's see. All right. Hopefully we got it. For today's webinar, we'll be looking at um, the water energy nexus with greenhouse gases and with scope 3. And I think for the success of our webinar, I will confer here with Crystal that it might be better for me to just go ahead and share my slides from my end. I think the control is not behaving in a way that will be easy on your eyes at this point. So I think I may need to be allowed to share screen. In the meantime, sorry guys, we're having this difficulty. We try to make it easy for everyone.
Yeah,
It's
Sam,
not.
can you go ahead and stop sharing your screen, please?
All right. Okay, let's see. Let's see if this works. All right. Can I get a thumbs up to know that I successfully shared my screen?
You're good.
Great, sweet. Sorry about that, guys. Let's start over. Webinar's agenda. Here's what we'll be covering today. We have about an hour and 15 minutes to cover a lot of topics, including I'll talk about value accounting, value chain accounting for water and wastewater cycles. We will learn how to estimate scope 3 emissions throughout the life cycle of water and wastewater. I'll show you how to locate emission factors to estimate emissions. We'll talk about water and wastewater performance metrics, and towards the end, a Q&A. I'd like to preface this webinar too with I'm leaning into the assumption that all of you have a base knowledge of greenhouse gas accounting. You know about scopes 1, 2, and 3 at a basic level. We are not going to be covering the full introduction of how to conduct greenhouse gas accounting, but resources are available, which I'll be mentioning throughout the webcast on how to locate them. All right, so without further ado, let's look at scope 3 greenhouse gas accounting. You should know by now that scope 3 emissions are a consequence of a company's activities, and they occur at sources not owned or controlled by the company. So they're considered to be indirect and not occurring within operations that you oversee within your organization. There are 15 categories that are used to allocate the scope 3 emissions to, and they're classified as either upstream or downstream from the perspective of the reporting organization. So here's an image that if you haven't seen it, I'll be very surprised. It's very famous. It's directly from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol corporate value chain standard, and it shows the 15 categories from scope 3, as well as direct scope 1 emissions that are within the organization's boundaries, and this special, quote unquote, special category of indirect emissions solely from purchased electricity, steam, cooling, heating. Right. For scope 3 voluntary greenhouse gas accounting, on the left side, our famous scope 3 standard, considered to be a cross-sectoral reporting standard and the baseline or the framework that has impacted every single other type of reporting mechanisms, including ISO, the climate registry, other voluntary and mandatory reporting programs across the world. So very well known. I would like to put parentheses too for those of you who did not know about this. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol is undergoing a revision process of all of their protocols for the corporate reporting, including the scope 3. But that process may take another year and a half to be concluded. So in the meantime, it is still considered as is a reporting to be followed or referred to. The corporate value chain contains a technical guidance, like an associated document that provides kind of detailed explanations on how to account for all the 15 categories in scope 3. But again, it does not provide sector-specific guidance. So for the purpose of your industries, if you are in the water industry, the wastewater industry, or you are a large end user consumer of water, The Climate Registry has developed many sector-specific guidance, as Crystal mentioned earlier today in our webcast. And the one that we'll be talking about or referring to or commenting on is the Water Energy Nexus Registry Protocol, which was developed for California water and wastewater managers to account for emission sources that occur in their operations. So CH4 or methane and nitrous oxide into emission sources there that occur within their boundaries. There is specific calculation methodologies well described in those protocols. So if you're not familiar with the protocol and you are struggling to find resources to account for those emissions, I'd highly recommend you to get familiarized with this protocol. And by following that protocol, you're also following the good practices and best practices in reporting for greenhouse gas accounting, and it fits within the GHG protocol framework as well. And along with the Water Energy Nexus Registry Protocol, the Climate Registry also has the Water Energy Greenhouse Gas Metrics, which is kind of an addendum, almost considered an appendix to the protocol, the at-large protocol, and provides even more detailed guidance and instructions on how to develop performance metrics or metrics for the outputs of operations in the water and wastewater industries. All right, today, as you probably saw in the description of the webinar, we'll be covering just a few categories. We're not going to be able to cover 15 categories, identify all the categories that will be relevant to an organization. So we'll be looking at the kind of that intersect of energy, greenhouse gases, and upstream, downstream water consumption, water delivery, wastewater discharge, treatment, and recycling of water. So for that, we picked 3 categories to cover. We'll go into detail on how to account and how to identify activity data for categories 1 and 5. And category 11 will be more of a conversation of should organizations be reporting those emissions or assessing them. So for category 1, that category is considered an upstream category from the reporting organization's perspective. It is the purchased goods and services, or labeled like that by the GHG protocol. And it accounts for the emissions from the production of products and services that are either purchased or acquired by the report organization. The key word here is acquired. Acquired does not necessarily mean purchased. So if you do consume water for free, that would still be considered a purchased good or service because you're acquiring that product within your organizational boundaries. The second category we'll be looking at is, I'm sorry, there is a typo here. It should be waste from operations and not processing of sold products. I apologize. Those are emissions that occur at facilities that are not owned or controlled by the report organization from the disposal and treatment of disposed waste and wastewater generated by the reporting organization. This is considered upstream category, even though it's occurring visually downstream from your operations, because it's considered a paid or acquired service by the report organization. So for all the waste and wastewater their organization generates, you would be looking at accounting for category 5 for waste from operations, not processing of sold products, as I have on my slide. And then category 11 is use of sold products. So those are the emissions that occur from the use of goods and services sold by the reporting company in the reporting year. So for water utilities and wastewater managers, if you are selling water or delivering water and recycled water, that might be a category that you might be looking at to account for. But again, I'll save that discussion for later today in the webcast. And reporting boundary. So the minimum reporting boundary is what determines what emissions should be accounted for under each of those categories. So for category 1, you are accounting for every emission source that is upstream from the point of receipt of your organization. So every single emission source that occurred in the production and delivery of a product that you purchased should be accounted under category 1. For category 5, waste generated from operations, it's all the emissions from the disposal and treatment of waste generated and wastewater discharged by the reporting company. So every treatment step until the end of life of that product should be accounted for under category 5 for all the waste. So that includes solid waste, food waste, or any type of common municipal or operational waste, as well as wastewater. And then I'm going to also open here that's very uncommon to find in inventories currently, organizations accounting for wastewater discharged or emissions associated with the wastewater discharged by companies. But we're hoping to change that so people can start looking at those metrics as well. And then the use of sold products is a direct use phase emissions of both sold final products and intermediate products for your end users. So I'll take a sip of water, kind of second. And we'll go into waste, end of life, and value chain. So for those who do manage waste, who do recycled water, or are looking at circular economy, this is a kind of a complex visualization of what happens with waste. If we are recycling water, how far upstream do we go? Do we account for the many times that the water has been recycled? So here's kind of a visualization that you would need to keep in mind as we go through the presentation today of what is included in category 5. When I say this, I mean what emissions should be accounted for once you dispose of your water or wastewater and your waste, and what should not be included, and how to look at that framework. And this framework follows the product standard accounting as well as other life cycle assessment. So waste will be generated through operations, and it usually leads to reaching its end of life. So if you dispose of something, it ends up at a landfill, you know, like that's a very clear waste life cycle. However, a lot of times, and which is a good thing that happens, waste gets diverted as well as wastewater to be repurposed or reused or recycled for beneficial use again. Once that product is diverted from its end of life, it is considered to begin another life, to be recycled, sold, used, and then disposed of again, or reach another life cycle of being repurposed. So those emissions, as soon as it's diverted, it's not considered anymore to be part of the end of life, and it's starting a new life cycle. I'll be talking about this as we move on in the presentation. So I just wanted to show you this visualization so you can start thinking about it that way if you do have operations that recycle products or consume recycled products as well. All right, so on the call, we probably have water managers, wastewater managers. I know by name that I know that you are here, as well as end users of water or industries that consume a large amount of water. And we'll be looking at the urban water cycle throughout this presentation. And I have some views of the water cycle depending on the perspective of which organization I'm talking to. I'd like to do a shout out that I adapted this image from the WEN registry protocol, the Water Energy Nexus protocol, just for visualization purposes. But this graph was developed through research to make sure it represents the California water use cycle. So as you can see here, there's a basic representation of where does water come from and where does it end. So it always starts with raw extraction of water from existing resources of available fresh water. It goes through conveyance or transportation to water treatment facilities, water distribution, and it reaches end users. This graph here representing a city or urban area. Users will discharge of the water after use, which will lead to a collection of the wastewater or disposed water. And it goes to wastewater treatment to be properly disposed of, meeting specific standards. And it will either be discharged back to the environment, go for co-product management, such as repurposing biosolids, biogas, or just being sent to landfill. But it might also enter a new life cycle. So the red dot to represent the beginning of a new life cycle from the perspective of GHG accounting, going through recycled water treatment, recycled water distribution, potentially replenishing groundwater, or going to long-term storage, and or back to being used as another product by end users. All right, so now we're going to determine the scope boundaries for our reporting purposes for water consumers. So if you're a water manager, wastewater manager, you can close your eyes for a second. This is for water consumers like myself or organizations who are out there. You are looking at yourself in this image of the buildings, a city, and you were thinking, what are the upstream emissions associated with the water that I'm consuming on site? So you will be looking at all the upstream emission sources that are embedded in your water supply, from extraction, cradle, to distribution, gate. So your gate is what your visualization, like getting to your tap water. So all the emission sources that may be occurring through your water supply chain should be included. So if your water manager extracts, treats, and distributes your water, you will be looking at understanding how much of their emissions is associated with the water amount that you consume. So you're looking all the way up to cradle. And when we say cradle, we're meaning the first point of extraction, the first point of emission source to extract specific resource to build a product. In this case, water, it's a simpler value chain, but a very unique one, as we know. Now for downstream, so once an end user or water consumer discharges of that water, they will be reporting in scope 3 the emission sources occurring after wastewater is discharged and will not be inclusive of the recycling water pathway, only the collection, treatment, and discharge of any sludge, biosolids, and all of that under category 5. Okay. And then in the case that you know for a fact that you are consuming recycled water, say for landscape purposes, you would then shift to that view. You are no longer consuming raw potable water from like a first raw resource. You were looking at recycled water, and then the upstream now is shifted to that new life cycle that I was pointing to. You are looking at recycled water treatment emission sources, the recycled water distribution for all the upstream emissions associated with that recycled water consumption. You are no longer looking at all the life cycle from extraction, treatment, distribution, discharge, recycled, all the way back to you. But you still account again for the treatment of the recycled water once you discharge of that water. I'll pause here and see if, Crystal, do we have any specific questions from water consumers, or if I can move on to another value chain view.
No, we don't have anything specific right now.
Great. All right, so now water managers, you can open your eyes. We'll talk about what's going on with your scope 3 boundaries. It really depends. It depends what operations you control and what you have, and where you maybe purchase specific source waters from different sources, especially in California. We know how much lack of this resource we have in the state of California. It's a rare finding, and you may need to have a lot of contracts across the state to convey water to your facilities, or you may be a wholesaler. You may manage the water projects in the state, and you may be in the direct point of contact with water and being the first emission source from a value chain perspective. So upstream emissions embedded in the water supply that you extract will depend on your operational boundary and activities. So say you only treat water and distribute water, you will be looking at your upstream suppliers to get information about the emissions associated with the extraction of the water that you purchase and the conveyance of water to your boundaries. So if you do extract water and distribute water to your end users, there will be considered most likely not applicable to you to have upstream emissions, because you are in a direct contact from cradle to delivery gate of the product. Downstream emissions occurring after wastewater is discharged from the product that you sell to your users would be accounted for under scope 3 under category 11 and 12. As I mentioned, we'll discuss category 11 later in the webcast, but for water managers, if that is something that you're already accounting for or thinking or doing analysis of the downstream emissions from the water that you deliver for treatment and discharge of wastewater, do put on the chat in the Q&A. I would love to hear more, but we'll discuss that specific scenario very soon. Now, for the wastewater managers, now you're the ones who can open your eyes. Collection of wastewater is considered the cradle. In the GHG protocol, it's very unclear. There is a lot of things that need to be addressed in this revision process that I mentioned earlier that were left undetermined or ambiguous. But one thing is very clear is that wastewater is considered a waste and a product in itself. From like that's the cradle. It's a waste product. So currently, wastewater managers or the wastewater managing of value chain scope 3 emissions accounting does not consider any upstream emissions from wastewater, since its collection point is considered going into its end of life, and you are now looking at all the upstream emissions associated with the what used to be treated water delivered to the users of water who discharged it to your operations. And downstream emission sources will be occurring from sludge that is sent to treatment or disposal outside of your boundaries. So if you do have sludge that is hauled daily to be sent to landfill managed by a third party, category 5 would apply to your wastewater management operations. Those are activities of extra waste being disposed of from your operations. And if you do sell recycled water, you could potentially also look at the category 11 reporting. All right. And why should we care? Why should we look at emissions and the life cycle of water, wastewater? Well, personally, I think it's very important because water is precious and we should all know this as humans. But also it requires a lot of energy, and the service that are being provided to us as individuals and as organizations by water and wastewater utilities is absolutely very precious. But us as individuals, we also have a role in this value chain of how much energy is used to get water to our taps and how much energy is used to recycled water or properly discharge water to avoid pollution downstream. But also it's very greenhouse gas intensive. There is a lot of large emission sources within just the water and wastewater cycle. And not to add the layer that we're not going to be talking to because it's out of our segment of today, is the impact of water as a limited resource on the planet. So we're not going to look at that. We're solely just looking at energy. So here I just have a little bit of representation of where are the big points of energy consumption. So when I say energy, you can think about those already equal or equate to greenhouse gas emissions. To generate energy, to use energy, you might be burning fossil fuel. You might be consuming electricity from the grid, which is generated by fossil fuel or less renewable than we wish there was. On the bottom right, I have this table from the California Water Energy publication resulting on the large research for the California Energy Commission back to 2005. It's kind of an old research, but it shows you a little bit of that range of how much energy it takes to move water through different segments. So I put a double, I forgot, a double icon where there is a large energy intensity of activities from specifically in the extraction and conveyance of water. It takes a lot of energy to extract water from groundwater or just move water across large fields or across state to get water to a facility. But I would like to point out that as users, we also use energy to heat water or sometimes cool water, such as using natural gas at homes to consume water. And one thing I want to point out, because we'll talk about this later today, is in literature around carbon footprint or energy intensity of water and wastewater to date has done a good job about looking at the energy intensity of water through what I was saying, just the energy consumption that it takes. But there's a large missing component that is usually in a segregated type of literature, which is the emissions from wastewater treatment. There is just a long research around the practices of wastewater, what the emissions are in different types of treatment, different types of facilities or practices they're implemented in wastewater treatment plants. But that type of emission sources, so the process emissions specifically from methane and nitrous oxide, are usually not included when we're looking at energy intensity of water and wastewater. And that's a big missing component that as a practitioner in the field, I hope to see more and more of performance metrics or average metrics statewide or nationwide of just the average emissions that encompass every emission source from wastewater and water. So I just want to point this out because, again, we will be looking at that. We're looking at category 5. Right. Okay, and here's one example, and I wanted to use an example from New Zealand. I don't know if there's anyone from New Zealand. If you're here, raise your hand. We'd love to say hello. But I just picked this inventory because it specifically outlined with percentages from water care in New Zealand. I think they're a large utility in Auckland area. And here they're disclosing their scope 1 and scope 2. They also have, if you're curious and looking them up, they also have scope 3 broken down by category. But I just wanted to show you the percentage distribution. They are both water and wastewater operations. And I want to show you the 41% of wastewater treatment. Those are most likely coming from CH4 and N2O, as I mentioned. And it's a big component of their emissions. And when we're looking at energy intensity metrics, generally that big percentage of the wastewater water use cycle might not be accounted for, as they might not be considered energy. Process emissions fall in that different category of what's going on chemically or process within an inventory. Whereas, purchase electricity considered only 10% of their total emissions. I also like to point out that they're also in a different electrical grid than the United States, for instance, and other countries. So their emissions will obviously not be as related to other countries who have different electrical grids. If they were fully renewable, we would see different emission levels here as well. All right, I'm gonna pause here for a second before we go straight into calculating emissions and see if there are any burning questions.
There is a couple.
Okay.
One of the questions says, how does sludge sent to land application by a wastewater utility fit in the scope 3 emissions?
Great question. All right, let's go back here. Stay tuned for the land use guidance that GHG Protocol is putting out. Those things are being actively talked about how to look at land application and land use. But you are also looking at it's kind of potentially considered like, let's say, a sold product or a discharge. So through the scope 3 accounting framework, you can look at it as waste disposed or use of sold product if there is a kind of a beneficial or a gain from selling biosolids or having that operation. But you'd be looking at all the emissions associated with the application of that to land within either category, depending on the lens. Unfortunately, maybe fortunately, the scope 3 framework is around a company either buying or selling. So if you're acquiring a service or acquiring a good, that's considered upstream. And if you're selling or disposing of or sending it to a different user, for any financial gain, that's considered downstream, but you would still capture those emissions through either the upstream or downstream, depending on, from your perspective, what are you either gaining or, I guess, procuring in terms of your activities for that. Does that answer your question?
I think that does. And then one quick question about New Zealand, and then I think we can hold off on the other questions till
Okay.
the end. Why were New Zealand's wastewater treatment emissions included under Scope 1 versus Scope 3?
Mhm. Excellent question. This is a water utility. This is a wastewater utility. So from their perspective, those emissions are occurring within their boundaries. And so they are direct emissions associated with this company. For an end user who is discharging wastewater to this utility, you would account for the emissions under your scope 3. So for if you're managing those activities, if you're managing those operations, scope 3 would be anything that it's not within your control. So if you're a wastewater manager, those are showing up in your scope 1 emissions. But if you're not, then that's wastewater discharge to a different organization to be taken care of. Great question.
And that's it for now, Alyssa.
Oh, sweet. Awesome. Thank you. All right. So, okay, before I do, estimating life cycle emissions. The biggest effort that we know of is getting data back into your spreadsheets and know what to do with them. So there's two things that, or one thing that is classified into primary or secondary, which is data. And here I'll be referring to data as both activity data and emission factors for calculation purposes. So that's why I said in the beginning of this webinar, if you're feeling a little lost because you have no greenhouse gas accounting background, the one thing I'll say here is like an introduction to it is activity data emission factors multiplied together will generally lead to an estimate of greenhouse gas emissions. So we use emission factors to be a metric of emissions accounting for a unit of product or unit of consumption. And activity data is what has happened within an emission source, either total consumption of electricity or total fuel consumption, et cetera, et cetera. So for value chain accounting, there is primary data, which is data sourced directly from suppliers or other entities within your company's value chain. And it usually has a lower degree of uncertainty. So obviously, if you have data that it's coming specifically from your operations and the suppliers within your field, those are generally more reliable than secondary data, which is considered generic, such as industry or regional averages or proxy data, and it may include life cycle analysis data. So if you're not able to contact your suppliers, if you're not able to get information, you might be looking at secondary data and looking at literature, looking at what's the average consumption of specific fuels, what's the average emissions of a water utility in Southern California or Northern New York, whatever, wherever you are in the world. And it usually comes with a higher degree of uncertainty. And I use usually carefully here as well and purpose because sometimes primary data might be not well managed and might have high degrees of uncertainty. And sometimes secondary data might be a better proxy, but that's not a, a, a a black and white answer. It really depends. So it's important to know where your data is coming from always, and have a good sense of like how that was estimated. So we'll be obviously focusing on primary data. I'll be touching on some secondary data as well. But for scope 3 categories, primary data is considered either product or service level GHG data, or suppliers organization-wide GHG data. So for the product or service GHG data, that includes your supplier scope 1 and scope 2 emissions that it's allocated to a product's production. So to our last question about why is it scope 1? If they're, it's a wastewater treatment, from a wastewater manager perspective, they would give a water user their scope 1 and scope 2 and say how much is associated with their treatment of wastewater. And then the supplier would also allocate any additional upstream emissions to the specific product. If the supplier of a product or any product. I'll be using just water and wastewater because of the webinar that we are in, but this is applicable to any type of product that you might be consuming or purchasing in your organization. So for water and wastewater utilities, that might be chemicals that you are purchasing, or lime, or any other type of product that you need for your operations. But you can also have suppliers organization-wide GHG data, which will include their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, their upstream emissions, but you also need the total production of their products, as well as allocate the emissions to your consumption. So if you're not their sole consumer, their own consumer, you would need to know how much of their emissions are associated with the portion that you consume from them. I do see your hand up, so I'm happy to maybe take that as a question. Natasha, I can see your hand.
Thank you.
Up.
Yes, my question is, yes, of course, scope 1, scope 2 from supplier for the products you're acquiring. But the second bullet is confusing because it says upstream emissions
Mhm.
product production.
Yes.
So wait, upstream, this was like, is this considered, I'm still trying to
Yeah.
finalize my understanding of it.
Yeah.
Would this
No,
include
thank you.
like transportation of raw material for supplier?
Yeah,
Or
you
use
got
the
it.
product of supplier? Because use of product is actually on
Mhm.
scope 1, right?
Yeah, no, perfect question, and you got it. So the suppliers' upstream emissions are all the upstream emissions associated before their own operations.
Before they're on,
So
thank you, I'm
their
sorry.
operations. Yeah,
Then it's
no
irrelevant.
worries. No,
Thank you.
it's perfect. So because for categories for accounting of emissions and specifically for the upstream emissions, you are looking for the cradle to your gate. So if your supplier is not all the way to cradle, you still need to know the upstream emissions from said supplier. So it gets very complicated really quick. As we know, scope 3, it does not come without challenges and some its own issues. Thank you for your question. All right, so I mentioned allocation. If a product specific greenhouse gas data is not available, so if you're not able to find how much greenhouse gases got emitted when you purchased an iPad or a tablet or a water bottle, you may need to allocate some emissions to your specific product. So allocation is the process of partitioning emissions from a single activity, operation, facility, or whole company into different outputs or products, and can be done either via physical allocation, total product output, or economically market output for the value of the product. And allocation increases uncertainty. So if your supplier is able to give you their total inventory, you may need to do allocation, as I said, to the units that you're purchasing across all the units that they produce. All right, so now we're going to dive into category 1. And we'll look at how to account for this one in the water and wastewater sectors. All the process that we'll be looking at here are applicable to, as I said, all products and services that you may consume as an organization. So this applies for the water managers on the line, the wastewater managers on the line, water users on the line. What we look at here applies to every calculation methodology for this category. So again, for category 1, you are looking at estimating the cradle to gate emissions from the production of goods and services purchased or acquired by the reporting company in the reporting year. So at the end of the year, you get your bill of materials, you get your utility bills, you get all the things that you purchased as an organization, and you would, according to GHG protocol standard for scope 3, look at all the emissions from cradle to gate, your receiving gate, for products such as water, chemicals, lime, machinery replacement parts, outsourced administrative functions, consulting services, and the list is infinite. This is a very short summary of examples. Now reporting boundary. So what's included? Lisa, what do you mean by cradle to gate? So it's, again, all upstream emission sources from point of receipt related to the water purchased or acquired by the reporting company. So that includes direct emissions from fuel use by the water companies, indirect emissions from electricity consumption. Again, it's a very energy intense process to extract and convey water, and other emission sources as they might be relevant. So might be industrial gases, refrigeration of certain types of products that, again, maybe not related to water, but for other products that you purchase. So as an end user perspective or a water manager perspective, you are looking at where is your gate, which could be any arrow that you see here, any blue arrow that you see on my screen. And you'd be accounting for everything all the way up to that first arrow, which is the energy that takes to extract raw water from a resource on Earth. Scope 3 standard prescribes 4 types of calculation methods that you can use to estimate category 1 emissions, and they are supplier specific, hybrid, average data, and spend-based method. The highlighted in brown are the supplier specific and average data are the ones that we'll be talking a little more and used as an example. So supplier specific requires product, service, or capital good level cradle to gate greenhouse gas emissions data from suppliers. So you might have experienced or seen online or in products labels such as, you know, total greenhouse gas per bottle or per phone or per any type of product of companies putting that information out there. And that's supplier specific, where they've conducted a product life cycle analysis of their products, and they're able to say what's the emissions embedded in their product delivered to you. Hybrid is really what it is. It's a kind of a mix and filling in the gaps with different data when you don't have them. So it requires supplier-specific primary data when available, and it's supplemented with secondary data to fill in the gaps. So it's a little bit more complex, but it's available for those of you who are not able to collect complete primary data, but you have some and you want to use it. Average data involves the collection of secondary data on the relevant unit of purchased good, services, or capital goods, and locating applicable emission factors or emission factors that are average. And spend-based requires the amount spent on each good, service, or capital good, and apply the EEIO emission factor. This is a mouthful. It's a specific type of emission factor data set that it looks at the economic input and output of generally of a country, of a specific economy and economic sector. I'm not going to get into much detail in this, otherwise it will be another half hour of our webinar, but it's available where you can just have emissions associated with the market value. This one specifically is really bad for water and wastewater because of the variability or the nature of the market value of water and not having a specific economic unit most of the times. All right, so determining the activity data that you need and the emission factors that you would need to locate in order to estimate category 1, either through supplier specific accounting method or the average data. So for the supplier specific, you need the total units of purchase or acquired goods and services and capital goods. So that might be total volume of water consumed on site. And you might be looking at your utility bills, purchase records, internal systems records, expense reports, invoices, receipts. All these sources might also be sources for all the products that you consume. For the emission factor, you will be calling up your water utility or municipal district for supplier-specific cradle-to-gate emission factor for each purchased good / total consumption of water or other services or the services types and capital goods. For average data, you don't have access to your supplier-specific information, so you are looking at the mass or volume or relevant unit of your purchased product. And then you'll be looking for a general or average cradle-to-gate emission factor per unit of mass or volume of your product. And you'll be looking at potential industry associations, life cycle inventory databases, or even environmental product declarations or EPDs. to locate what is the average emissions intensity of a specific product in this market or in the industry, and you may find them over there. All right, so here's a simplified example of estimating emissions embedded in the water consumed. So a water utility company is estimating upstream emissions using supplier-specific method for water acquired from the state's water project by the Department of Water Resources and distributed by Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. MWD publishes verified emission factors, and no allocation is needed by the report organization. So in this case, the water utility contacts wholesalers who are the ones extracting water to consume that water for treatment and distribution to their service area. And they consume 500,000 acre feet of water, and they locate that total amount through contracts with MWD. And water utility company identifies or locates the verified emission factor by MWD at the Water Energy Nexus Registry portal, which contains verified emission factors for those companies who report to the WEN registry and have those metrics verified. They conduct a complete GHG inventory, and they locate that for water purchased from MWD, it is a 0.1665 tons of CO2 equivalent per acre feet. So in this case, this water utility had an easy job, and they were just able to multiply their activity data by the emission factor they located and landed on a total of 83,250 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent for all the water that they purchased from MWD, and report those emissions under category 1. Now, another example is a beverage company is estimating upstream emissions using the average data method for water purchase from their water utility. This should have been supplier-specific method. Their supplier does not publish, however, water product-specific emission factors or their greenhouse gas emissions inventory specifically allocated to their products, but they publish their total scope 1, 2, and 3, and allocation would be necessary to estimate emissions for category 1 for this beverage company. So the water utility publishes their total scope 1 as 75,000, scope 2 for purchased electricity is 250,000, and for scope 3, 83,250. And they also disclose how much water they deliver to their customers, which is 1,250,000 acre feet for a given year. And in this case, the company had to do some allocation. It is unclear how much of the emissions of this organization are actually associated with water treatment or water delivered to them. So this increases, again, uncertainty. And the way that they calculate an emission factor is by summing up scope 1, 2, and 3 of this organization and dividing by their total delivered output, and derived a 0.33 tons of CO2 equivalent per acre feet. I will say again, this adds a lot of uncertainty because it's not clear, if I go back to the previous slide, about is the 83,000 associated with their water system, wastewater or water systems. So in this case, you were making a huge assumption, which would be documented in your inventory to estimate the 0.33. But you use that metric, you disclose that as the beverage company, and you land on an 81 ton of CO2 equivalent reported in the category 1 for purchased good, parentheses, water. Right. All right. Before I go to category 5, are there any questions?
Yes. There is a question that came in on, could you comment on how WEN water-related performance metrics can be used for supporting the reporting of scope 3, category 1 emissions for purchased acquired water from both a utility and end user perspective?
Perfect. The last set of slides that I have are specifically about the water performance metrics. They're reported to the
power went out in the office.
I think someone got muted. Sorry about that. Yes, it can be used. And we'll look at boundary setting and how the metrics are developed. So there are two types of metrics, the system average and the delivery metric. Those two would be applicable to account for scope 3 category 1 for either perspective. So we'll look at that in the next few slides. But as I used in my example here, and this one, it's important to understand which utility you're looking at, who is publishing emission factors, and what's their system boundary and what they are delivering as a product. So you know if that emission factor is applicable to your purposes. But 100%, the guidance and the development of the WEN registry and the water energy greenhouse gas metrics developed by the climate registry were developed with the intention of allocating emissions to water or wastewater systems to be used to determine a complete value chain of the state of California if all companies were doing their metrics. So yeah, 100% applicable, and we'll look at it again towards the end of my presentation.
Let's say real quick on that slide for Metropolitan Water District, what is MWD's scope 3 in that example?
That's the category 11 that we can look at soon. So for MWD, who is selling water, they would look at the processing of sold product, the use of sold product, and end of life of sold product of water. But that's considered optional by GHG protocol standard, optional boundary. And hence why it's more of a choice if they would like to report that. But we'll look at category 11. There's 2 raised hands. I'm not sure what's the order. I don't know. I think maybe Natasha was first. Happy to take them right now. I think we have enough time.
Natasha, so, okay, do we distinct suppliers scope 1 plus 2 sum versus supplier scope 3 when we are reporting under our scope 3?
You can, yeah, that would be the most transparent way of doing that instead of just aggregating it all. And I'll even go further for scope 3. You're also wanting to look at the division, not division, but the partitioning of by gas as well. So for all your reporting, want to report by individual gases, by CO2, CH4, N2O,
Not by
HFC,
equivalent.
PFCs. Yeah, not by equivalent. And you also have to disclose which global warming potential sets you're using. So ideally, yeah, if you can disclose that, that would be great. There might be confidentiality issues where companies only disclose with an MOU in place that you cannot disclose their emissions, so you might have to aggregate them. Not necessary. It's not important. I think you only need to disclose if you use primary data or secondary data, what's the percentage of supplier specific data that you're using in your accounting. But for inventory,
I'm sorry, but it's very important to distinct downstream and upstream, right? Because
100%, yes.
We don't want to include downstream because that's our scope 1. But we do want to account for transportation.
Correct. Yeah. So if the company disclaims all of their scope 3 and they have a scope 3 for use of their product, that's including your own emissions as their end user. So you only want to account for the emissions associated with their upstream until you receive them. So yeah, you were thinking about it very correctly. Thank you. David, on there.
Yes, thanks. I wanted to follow up on this question about the supplier-specific emission factors. And one of the things that I think happens sometimes is there's confusion about what the water supplier is supposed to include in their boundaries. I know, for example, Metropolitan does not include imported or acquired water resources in their inventory. And so I guess the point is that there needs to be some clarity and some direction around, and transparency maybe is the right word, around what the limitations of some of these supplier specific factors are. Because if you're a customer of MWD and you think you're capturing all of your upstream scope 3 emissions from purchased water by using this emission factor, you're actually only maybe capturing, the things that are within the boundaries of their inventory.
Yeah, thank you, David. No, that's an excellent point. I'll go over the life cycle boundary setting, our system boundary when we're looking at product footprint, and some of my bullet points are to the biggest work that organizations will be doing when developing scope 3 is looking at other documentation around the emission. It's more work about figuring out if the emission factor is appropriate, if it's geographically appropriate, technology appropriate, boundary appropriate, so you are not purposefully, unintentionally including more or less than you were hoping for. So in the case of MWD, you got to really look at what's included that and document that. So for instance, in this conversation with David, if I'm an inventory compiler, I can call MWD and say, what's included? What's your, like, is this with the product that I'm consuming? Is this appropriate for what I get from you? And that might be a yes, that might be a no, but it might be close enough. And the perfect data may not be available, but it's very important for you to not just pick a number as they are and understand what's included. And in the registry, in the Water Energy Nexus registry, there is specific guidance for the water managers and wastewater managers to what should be included in their metrics, and it provides guidance on how to allocate emissions to their operations. So I don't have all the context of how the metrics got developed for this specific purpose, but I trust the verification process that these organizations go through and following the guidance that it was established within the protocol, and the reasoning behind maybe not including specific sources in their emissions inventory. So yeah, great. Thank you, David, for bringing that up. That's definitely very key, and I have a couple more slides on that. Lily, I'll take your question and then we'll move on.
It's quick. I was just hoping that you could go back to slide 26 for a moment so I could take another look. Thank you.
Sweet. That was definitely very quick. Thank you. All right. I will give Lily another second and then move on to this one, which we already covered. And we'll go to category 5, waste generated in operations. So now, going into this one, these are the emission sources that occur at facilities not owned or controlled by the report organization from the disposal and treatment of disposed waste and wastewater discharged that is generated in the report organization's boundaries. So water utilities or wastewater managers who are treating wastewater, this shows up in your scope 1. But if not, if you are sending sludge to landfill, this applies. And if you're doing both, also applies. So activities may include disposal in the landfill, recovery for recycling. So it doesn't include the recycle process, but the recovery too. Incineration of waste, composting, let's say biosolids, or application to solid of biosolids, waste to energy or energy from waste, and wastewater treatment, which is our focus of the call. Reporting boundary for category 5 includes the emissions from the disposal and or treatment of waste generated and wastewater discharge from the report organization within the reporting year. So this includes scope 1 and 2 from emissions from the upstream waste management value chain partner, for example, wastewater managers. So most likely won't have scope 3 emissions associated with this. So it's that kind of, this is the boundary that will be the focus of calculating category 5 for those who are disposing of wastewater and waste, and includes the waste collection, wastewater treatment, co-product management. Let's say the wastewater goes through additional treatment or additional reuse or repurposing before it reaches end of life, and it might be discharged. It might have water emissions associated with aquatic environments as well. So you're looking at the whole life cycle of the wastewater once it becomes waste until it reaches end of life, full decomposition of every nutrient found in wastewater. For this one, the Scope 3 standard prescribes 3 calculation methods or quantification methods. The supplier specific again, the waste type specific. This one is unique to the category 5, and average data. For supply specific, we're looking at Scope 1 and 2 emissions data collected directly from the waste management companies related to the specific waste activities, landfill, incineration, wastewater treatment, wastewater discharge. Waste type specific emission factors are used for each combination of waste type and treatment method. Once you look at your solid waste, that's where the most work generally occurs, because you need to know every single composition of the waste that you dispose of and categorize that by treatment type. So if part of your waste is recycled, another part is incinerated, and the other part goes straight to landfill, you'd have to do a complete categorization of your waste disposal profile to account for that emission. And average data emissions estimates are based on the total waste to each disposal/treatment activity and applies average emission factors for each of those activities. All right. Again, our table of activity data and emission factor. Supplier specific, same thing. You were looking at total Scope 1 and Scope 2 of your supplier, and the total waste and wastewater managed by your supplier, total mass of waste or volume of wastewater that you send to your service supplier, and total volume of wastewater discharged. No need for emission factor in this case, because you would be just allocating emissions to the proportion of your waste compared to the total waste handled by your supplier. And average data is collecting the amount of your activity, either total waste or total wastewater discharged. You'll be looking at average data emission factors based on all types of disposal types and wastewater treatment types. You might be finding emission factors from industry associations, again, life cycle databases like the WEN application that's published by the US Environmental Protection Agency, other government agencies, and academic literature. And here is an example, and I have a red text that I'll read at the end. So we're looking at a food packaging company that is estimating the upstream emissions from wastewater discharge from their operations to sewer. A reminder that upstream emissions in this case, even though it's downstream from their perspective, they are paying for the discharge of their waste. So it's considered upstream from GHG protocol. Their wastewater utility does not have greenhouse gas data available to share. The company estimates that the total wastewater discharge during the reporting year and assumes a 95% volume of consumed water supply to be discharged as wastewater. In other words, 5% is retained in their operations. So they're not able to measure how much it was actually piped out. And they come up with a total of 55 million gallons of wastewater were discharged, and it was measured outside and derived number. For emission factor type, this company struggled a lot to find an average emission factor that would account for every emission source in the wastewater treatment. But it located this literature, which I cite here on the right, that is called Operational Carbon Footprint of the Water, US and Wastewater Sector's Energy Consumption. And this is a very limited boundary. So to David's point on understanding what emission sources are included in an emission factor, this one in the wastewater side is very key to pay attention to. Myself, who I'm very used to looking up emission factors and trying to locate literature, it was very challenging to find averages, average data that includes the process emissions that we talked about earlier in the webinar, that includes the CH4 and N2O emissions from wastewater treatment. This emission factor only includes the energy use, and it's not inclusive of process emissions. This will significantly underestimate this emission source. As an inventory compiler for this food packaging company, I would document that and say, very limited data available, room for improvement in my next inventory cycle until I find a better emission factor. I calculate the emissions and I land on that 81 tons of CO2 equivalent. And I report that under my category 5 as upstream emissions from wastewater discharge from my operations. All right. I'll move on because I want to make sure that we have time for for a chat. Category 11, we're not going to do examples, but here's what I was promising for those companies in the water sector who sell water. You are in the interesting position of looking at the environmental impact or the greenhouse gas impact of the water that you sell to end users or deliver to end users. For category 11, that's a category that it's for emissions that occur from the use of goods and services sold by the reporting company. The emissions from sold products would include the end user scope 1 and 2 that occur when using said products or services. However, the minimum boundary, the required boundary of reporting currently in the scope 3 are for products that directly consume energy, like fuels and electricity. Think about a car, a phone that you charge. Also includes fuels and feedstock. So if someone sells natural gas, this is where they would report the combustion of natural gas. And other greenhouse gas or products that contain a container of greenhouse gas that they release, such as aerosol cans or refrigerants for air conditioning. And it contains an optional boundary, which is the indirect use phase of emissions of sold products over their expected lifetime. So in other words, emissions from use of products that indirectly consume energy, which is the case of water. Water, when you use water, when you drink water, when you apply water, it does not require energy, but if you are heating your water, if you're freezing your water, whatever you are doing, that's indirectly consuming energy, and that falls under the optional category. And that will be the same for the categories of processing of sold product and end of life of sold product. So the company selling water could report the water treatment part under category 12, which is the end of life of sold products, and then account for the disposal, wastewater treatment of all the water sold that doesn't get recycled. And to do so, I'm going to do this very quickly. I'm checking time. To do such assessment can be very critical for the water energy nexus in any part of the world, and it's especially in California, for water users and end users and wastewater companies to come together to understand all the hotspots within the value chain. To understand where might be in the water use cycle, where might be the biggest opportunities for intervention that will unlock opportunities and achieve emission reductions, either by energy efficient ways of heating water, but also less GHG intensity intensive emission profiles, either upstream or downstream of the water use and the water discharge value chain. So for water companies, it's important to do that assessment, and you have to look at the product use profile of water, the type of industries that you serve, the type of end users, and their usual practices of heating and using water. And for water end users, consider disclosing within your GHG inventory the emissions associated from your scope 1 and scope 2 with the different types of main products that you might be using. So for water, you could say how much of natural gas or heating you are doing for the purpose of consuming water. And yeah, unlocking that collaboration is very key. And one of the main purposes of the Water Energy Nexus Registry that was established by the Climate Registry and the California Environmental Protection Agency to provide enough guidance for all these metrics and understanding of where are the most energy intensive activities, as well as the larger GHG emission sources within this value chain. Ali, I do see your hand. I'm gonna ask you to hold on for 1 second so I can just finish the presentation and we can start a Q&A really quick. Locating emission factor databases. I won't be able to go into much detail, but I've already been talking about this in terms of navigating the life cycle assessment databases. This is a very common way of locating emission factors for scope 3 purposes. The one thing I want to point out, which David was flagging indirectly, is understanding what emission factor you need and where are you located in a value chain. Generally speaking, on the image on the left, emission factors are published cradle to grave or cradle to gate. But in reality, you might be placed in very different locations of a value chain of a product. and you don't want to use an emission factor that includes more activities or less activities than what you need. So when navigating life cycle data sets or performance metrics, you always have to look at the documentation to know if that's applicable to your purpose, to your product, and to the service that you are consuming as a company. You also locate, or you'll be able to find not only life cycle assessment databases, but product footprints and performance metrics. Luckily, with time now, GHG accounting is becoming more and more relevant by organizations that were pursuing, doing the right thing, and are looking at developing the product-specific profiles following ISO 14067, which is a specific guidance for guidelines for quantification of carbon footprint of products, as well as GHG protocol, product standard, and the PAS 2050. So those are keywords that you can throw on the internet, see if there is specific emission factor databases for products that you're consuming. And for GHG performance or intensity metrics for industry-specific guidance, the Climate Registry has at least three sectors: the electric power sector, the oil and gas, and the water and wastewater sectors, who provide specific guidance on how to account for ton of greenhouse gases per a unit of output of a specific industry organization. So here's some example of average data sets. So if you come across them, you should know that they might not be representative of your operations, but might be close enough. If you are doing scope 3 inventories for a while, you've probably seen the UK DEFRA emission factor data sets. They publish water supply and water treatment average emission factors. Obviously, for anyone outside of the UK, these might be very unrealistically close to your profile use of water. But here are examples of how you can try to find if your country has this type of data sets available. And similarly, this is a New Zealand guidebook for voluntary reporting in the country. They also contain, they also provide emission factors for domestic water and industrial wastewater discharge and water supply. Again, if you're not in New Zealand, most likely you don't want to use these. Other types of average data sets, academic literature here on the left is the one that I used in some of the examples. So be comfortable with searching literature, be comfortable searching keywords for where you are, and also contacting your local utility and asking them to develop their metrics and disclose their greenhouse gas inventories. The table on the right is another form of literature provided by the Pacific Institute on California electricity intensity and natural gas energy intensities. For this one specifically for water generation and extraction, but they have more tables from the different types of life cycle stages of water. For known water products, I mentioned a few slides in the sources of data, environmental product declarations. I have one example of a large data set that contains different types of products. This one here on the right specifically for hydrogen peroxide. So for companies who are purchasing large amounts of hydrogen peroxide, the environmental product declarations show the system diagram of every single source that is included in the boundary of their assessment. And they have a summary of the upstream, the core use, and downstream use of hydrogen peroxide. So for a company consuming hydrogen peroxide, they would look at the upstream emissions associated with a unit of a bottle. I think it's a bottle or a liter. Let's see. Not sure if it's here, but that's an emission factor that you can look at. Accounting challenges. I think we've been talking about them. I usually spend some time talking about this. But scope 3 has many, many challenges, many things that are left ambiguous and in a gray area. And the hope is that for the revision of the protocol, those things will be addressed. Activity data collection, identifying emission factors is almost unrealistic to be able to do a complete inventory of every single possible emission source from your organization's perspective. And those are concerns that have been expressed over and over in the last 15 years to the GHG protocol, and which we hope that they will be able to address in the revision process. So if this is new to you, you just know the journey ahead is very challenging, but there are many resources out there to help support you in this journey. And last but not the least, the performance metrics. And apologize that I have to rush a little bit so we can get a little bit of a Q&A in the end. And as Crystal said earlier, I'm available to stay another 15, 20 minutes on the call. If you are too, you're welcome to stay here with me. The Water Energy Nexus Registry Protocol provides companies with guidance on how to develop efficiency and delivery metrics for their operations from water and wastewater perspectives. So this is applicable for the managers out there, not the end users, on how to develop and how to allocate emissions to your systems and develop efficiency and delivery metrics, and also goes through a process of verification. There's also a verification protocol on how to verify those metrics. So see, and here's where you find them. Obviously, not all utilities are currently reporting, which is the hope for the future. But for those of you who have verified on a yearly basis, shout out to you. I hope your name is showing up here. If not, please, for those folks who have not heard of this resource, do visit the climateregistry.org/download/water energy nexus metrics, and you'll be able to access some of those emission factors and access the documentation behind it and what's included in their systems and what's accounted for. And maybe, and I use very carefully here, David, I hope you appreciate, maybe applicable to be used across the value chain to estimate scope 3 emissions, if that's your utility provider, if they're verifying the metrics and if they're disclosing all the sources that are included in their emissions performance metrics for the water and or wastewater that they deliver or treat. All right, Q&A time. I apologize. We officially only have 5 minutes. So Ali, I will give you the floor because you have your hand up, and then we'll go through the chat.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Thank you very much. This is actually Tony Pastore. Ali sent me the link and asked me to attend on his behalf. So Tony Pastore from Terra Verde Energy. We're energy consultants, owners, reps, working in the water industry on all things energy related. My question for you is around templates and or other sort of fill in the blank type documents that might exist at the Energy Water Nexus, at the Climate Registry. Are there any documents like that where we can sort of do our best to help water agencies, kind of walk through, fill in the blanks as best we can, and sort of see what kind of numbers come out the other end? Anything like that available?
Thank you. I see Crystal already unmuted herself. I think, I'll pass it. I know exactly what she's going to say. So Crystal, take it on.
Yeah, that's a really great question. We have just created a calculation tool just for that purpose. So we will be sharing that calculation tool in the webinar recap email. So keep an eye out for that webinar recap email to download the calculation tool.
I will definitely keep my eyes peeled. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. And we've got quite a bit of questions. I think I'll find one that we can ask now, and then we'll finish asking the rest of them after. One question comes from another consultant where they say that their client is hesitant to add analysis for their scope 3 because their board sees it as external to their operations, that they are not required to report, and they see limited opportunity for action. Where do you see mandatory scope 3 reporting pushing agencies to full analysis and annual tracking?
Yeah. Oh, that is a tough one. At the Institute, at the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute, we have a lot of concerns in general, very public, about the scope 3 being or not being fit for purpose, and what it actually discloses in terms of data and what it represents. With pressure from public reporting or mandatory reporting, scope 3 is becoming more and more imminent, but it comes with a lot of flaws and problems in itself. But companies are doing it. They're trying to fit into this frame, and and we it's inherently known that scope 3 is outside and it's external to the operations of a specific organization. You're just looking at your role within a value chain. A lot of the data derived from scope 3 accounting may be very challenging to get, or a number that it's not really even manageable by an organization to be able to have any sort of influence over of reducing emissions from their suppliers, or any downstream use of their products. So you're really just reporting data across. So there is not really an answer to that, other than we just hope that the frameworks, either through revision of the GHG protocol or through mandatory reporting, that it becomes more and more clear what must be reported, if anything, around indirect emissions for scope 3 accounting, and it becomes more sector specific and more related to specific operations versus a one size fits all, just report every single thing. I hope that answers, but yeah, there's way too many concerns about scope 3 that I'll be happy to chat about. I do see a question someone posted here about Derek Brokoff and Michael Gillenwater, my colleagues, longtime partners, and writing about scope 3 not being fit for purpose. Yeah, we have a lot of literature out there, and we're very vocal about it, and we're hoping to push as much as we can. I myself am in the technical working group for scope 3, and those things are, I try to bring them up as much as I can. And yeah, we'll keep pushing.
All right. Because we are at the 11:30 mark, we will end the official webinar at this time. So thank you to everyone for joining us for this very interesting topic and webinar presented by Alyssa. And the recording of the webinar will be shared in a webinar recap email. And if you are interested in joining our newsletter or joining the climate registry, please sign up from the climateregistry.org, and we look forward to seeing you all at future webinars.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for joining.